The end was really only the beginning. Hi, I'm Scott. It's about to get pretty crowded on the Velvet Underground bandwagon. Lou Reed was 28 years old and broke, and he feared the Velvet Underground held no future for him when he told Moe Tucker one night in August 1970 that he was done. Loaded was the last album Reed recorded with the Velvets, but as we now know, this obscure band's influence exploded across the rock landscape in the years to come. The Velvet Underground truly was a band ahead of its time, way ahead of its time. They appeared, they made a lot of noise that fell on mostly deaf ears, and then they vanished long before the world even noticed that they were here. Before I move on from the Velvet Underground and start chronicling Lou Reed's solo discography, let's take a pause to talk about some of the VU riches that were to surface later. Cotillion Records was disappointed that Loaded fell flat in the marketplace. The label was contracted for another Velvet Underground album, but they were in no mood to try again with this ragtag outfit, so Cotillion found a cheap way out. A staffer got his hands on some cassette tapes recorded tableside by a fan during Lou Reed's final shows with the Velvets at Max's Kansas City. The label sourced those tapes for the radically lo-fi Live at Max's Kansas City, which Cotillion released in May 1972, hoping to recoup some of the costs of making Loaded. Don't bother with it if you've never heard it. It's an interesting listen, perhaps, for history-curious Lou Reed and Velvet Underground fans, but for the most part, it's really not worth your time. Squeeze, the final official studio album by the Velvet Underground, appeared in February 1973. Manager Steve Sesnick managed to strike a deal with Polydor Records during a 1971 European tour by a Doug Yule-fronted version of the Velvets. Sesnick sent Yule into a London studio with Deep Purple drummer Ian Pace to hastily write and record some songs for a new Velvet Underground album. Polydor, though, was not impressed by the finished product, and the label sat on it. They did revive it and gave it a European release after Lou Reed's career caught fire in November 1972 with Transformer. In retrospect, Squeeze is not a horrible album, it's just not a very good one. The first posthumous VU album to gain traction arrived in September 1974 via Mercury Records. The two-disc 1969 Velvet Underground Live with Lou Reed was instigated by Reed's management about the time that Lou's solo career was getting some traction. These raw recordings from a couple of shows during the band's 1969 tour provided a pretty good indication of what the band really was like during this time. A couple tracks on this record are tedious, but most of them are revelatory. This album is an essential listen for fans and the VU curious. I'll talk about this one more in depth as we get to September 1974 in the Lou Reed timeline. The Real Motherload from the VU archives arrived in February 1985. The Velvet Underground's influence on all facets of rock music had become well recognized by this point. Someone at Polygram decided it would be a good idea to reissue those first three Velvet Underground albums, which had been out of print for over a decade and which Polygram now owned. So Polygram dove into the MGM Records vaults to retrieve the master tapes. They did find those master tapes, but lo and behold, they also emerged with those long-lost tracks the band had recorded for their abandoned fourth album. Polygram released the compilation LP titled VU on the Verve Records label, and it became the highest charting Velvet Underground album ever. I'll go into detail on this release as we approach February 1985 in our Lou Reed timeline. Stay tuned. The original lineup of the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed, John Cale, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker, reunited for a European tour in 1993 that resulted in a live album and a concert film for home video. This stuff was okay. There was nothing particularly interesting or inspiring. The best thing about this is to watch the video to see Mo Tucker and Sterling Morrison in action, because we never really got to see much of that. We've gotten several more Vault releases and remastered editions and box sets in the decades since. The most notable of the box sets was Peel Slowly and See, a 5-disc retrospective issued by Polydor in September 1995 that included all 4 of the Lou Reed Velvet Underground albums, as well as several outtakes and demos. A couple of Polydor-issued live albums from the 1969 tour might be worth looking up. The 3-disc The Quine tapes, released in October 2001, and the 4-disc The Complete Matrix tapes, issued in November 2015, were pretty good, but this mostly covers the same ground as the 1969 album released several years earlier. Lou Reed obviously did not know it at the time, but the Velvet Underground had a huge future when he abandoned the band. Thanks in large part to Lou's successes with RCA Records in the early years of his solo career, the VU went from little more than an obscure footnote in 1970 to one of the most important bands in music history by the end of the 20th century. Reed did have a fairly long career as a solo artist. He never attained the mainstream popularity that he sought after a short run of success in the early and mid-1970s, but his influence on the entire sphere of rock music became profound. So come on, claim your seat on the bandwagon. Next stop, an examination of Lou Reed's 1972 solo debut. I will see you then.